can make someone extremely aero, but they won't be able to produce power in that position or stay comfortable enough to produce power and stay fast. Many riders have that. They have these cycles of good performance, declining performance, illness, recovery, good performance, declining performance, illness, and they wonder why. And the reality is it's simply because you're doing too much. And so we typically see knee pain in the early part of the season when riders have been off, and then they start to increase their training load. And when they increase their training load quickly, that's a high risk time. The true measure of performance is performance. So if you go out and you do a 30-second maximal effort, a 1-minute maximal effort, a 5-minute maximal effort, a 10-minute maximal effort, and a 20-minute maximal effort, then you get a very good idea of where your strengths and weaknesses are. Do what's required. Don't try and rush it. There are no shortcuts. So every overnight success takes 10 years. So, maybe not 10 years, but it takes time. So be consistent, and if you consistently apply the right principles, you'll get there.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch, and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. How did you first get started in the cycling world? How did you first get involved?
That goes back quite some time. In my teens, I was actually a very successful runner. I used to run 800 meters and 1500 meters, and I was in a very competitive age group in South Africa that included Ezekiel Sepeng, Marius van Heerden, Joshua Pedersen, and a few other athletes that went on to Olympic medals and world championship wins and world indoor records and so on. And so, we were running world bests at that time for 1500 meters, and then I injured my knee, and I've got a little congenital anomaly in my left knee which precluded me from doing any significant running, and as a result of that I started cycling. And cycling, just initially it was just to stay fit, and I realized obviously that the strengths from running translated well into performance in cycling, and moved on to the mountain bike scene, where one of my digs mates, a guy who was in college with me and shared an apartment with me, he was racing the national cross country scene, and I started going to races with him, and he became national champion 3 years before I did, and I kept progressing. And then I was studying medicine at the time, and when I finished studying medicine, I was number 2 in the country, and at that point I decided, okay, I'm going to take time out and race professionally. So I did nothing but ride my bike for 2 years, did the international racing scene, went to 2 world championships, and I didn't do as well as I thought I would be able to, and realized that I wasn't going to make a living out of being a professional cyclist. And so at that point I stopped. I enrolled for a PhD in exercise science at UCT again. And while I was doing my PhD, I enrolled for a master's in sports medicine and did that concurrently. But I kept involved in cycling. We had a high performance cycling division in the Sports Science Institute where I'm based, but it had sort of stagnated. And so when I started my PhD, I resurrected that and started with cycling biomechanics and then performance testing, and then into coaching. And that's back in 2003. And it grew from there, and it kept growing and growing, and here we are in 2021.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to your earlier days. So when you switched from running to cycling, obviously the running was on a much shorter distance than what the cycling events usually look like. But could you give a comparison of maybe the main differences between running and cycling from a training standpoint?
Yeah, so the running is, especially middle distance, is very much based on maximal physiological capabilities, so VO2 max type of efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And cycling, and this is actually something my current PhD student James Sprague is currently investigating, is the fatigue resistance phenomena, which is something that a lot of people are talking about at the moment, and that's really the key difference.
Mm-hmm.
Cycling, the best performances occur after hours of stochastic, so in other words, high intensity, low intensity, high intensity, low intensity activity, which lasts a few hours before the final decisive attacks and race winning moves are made.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the big difference. It's about who can perform that kind of level of effort after already having performed 2 or 3 hours of activity. So the endurance component and the fatigue resistance component is a much bigger aspect of cycling than it is in running. And in running, you're often, whether it's marathon or 1500, the intensity is relatively constant compared to cycling, which is highly stochastic.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it's also, you do see big variations in, uphills and downhills on the running side as well, once you get off the track. But I guess given just the sheer number of kilometers that you cover in a cycling race versus a running race, there's a lot more opportunities. And obviously it's a much bigger part of cycling as well to just, go up and down a lot, which adds that extra level of complexity, because if it was only, obviously you can go faster and slower on a flat, and that obviously is a lot to manage, but now you include, slopes, and I guess that throws another parameter to consider in the training and also the racing.
Of course, and the technical element as well. I mean, on the road, the ability to position yourself, the drafting, knowing, the timing of attacks, when to go, whether or not it's going to be successful, how to judge all the opponents and gauge when the correct efforts are to be made. There's that huge technical aspect. Of course, there's surges in running as well, but it's with the drafting in cycling, it's so much of a bigger impact in terms of the actual technical aspect of how you time those and put in those efforts.
Yeah, maybe can we talk a little bit more about this aspect of cycling? I guess it's something that we maybe viewers get acquainted to. So for people who are not cycling, but people who are watching the races, something you get acquainted to through the commentators' analysis of what's going on during the race. But I can imagine it goes much, much deeper in terms of just all the details of those different strategies within the team. So can you talk a little bit more about how those things are organized, or the plans in advance in terms of strategies and communication around this, and maybe even sessions dedicated to that aspect of the race?
Definitely. So, I mean, cycling on the road is like chess on wheels. There's so many different moving components to it. You have the pre-race plan, and that is something that's generally decided by the team managers, the director sportifs, and there'll be one director sportif who's the lead director sportif for that particular race. The plan is obviously communicated to the riders. They have various roles, and the proposed plan is discussed, but there are alternatives that are also often discussed, because things evolve and you need to respond to how the race unfolds. And then on the road, the riders, and this is one of the things that some people think has destroyed some of the purity of cycling, and there's merits to each view, but the riders are in contact with the car, with the radio. The car obviously watches the television footage, has access to the timing gaps, and communicates that back to the team. And so there's constant discussion of the tactics and what to do next. And the riders are aware of where other riders are on the road, and can then gauge the effort in terms of, if there's a breakaway, whether or not they need to work harder to bring the breakaway back on time to make sure that it ends in a result that's favorable for the team. So those things are constantly happening. And then within the peloton itself, not only the overall tactics, but the specific position of the rider, at any given time is a very important technical skill. Learning to be able to stay in the peloton, which is, it's a surging mass, and so gaps open up and close. And if the rider doesn't stay on the wheel, doesn't get into a gap, they'll quickly find themselves at the back of the peloton, and then you're expending more effort, and eventually they can get spat out. So, really competent riders in other disciplines like mountain biking can find it extremely difficult on the road because they don't have those skills to be able to sit in the peloton. And then, you get to the sprint and things get really, there's footage now from Velon. They produce quite a lot of footage from the cameras on the bikes. And if you watch those in, for instance, the last 5 kilometers of a sprint, you really get an idea of how chaotic it is and how difficult it is to follow wheels and to be part of that race. So all of that is happening and not always evident to people who are watching, and especially newbies who watch cycling and they go, this is boring. But as you start to learn about cycling, it becomes much more interesting. I guess the same applies to any sport, but you start to understand the game that's actually evolving as you watch.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, towards the end of a race, when the sprint, kind of kicks into gear, not only is there this heavy strategic component of where to place yourself, when's the right moment to push forward, but then the guys are at the end of a long race and they're probably pushing at the maximum of their physiological capacity, and they have to, make decisions in that setting.
Yeah, sorry, I lost internet there a little bit, so I missed your question. Sorry, the problems of our times with online interviews. You want to repeat that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was saying, not only are they at the end of a long race and they have to think strategically to try and get to the finish line first, but they're also under heavy fatigue and they're at their physiological limit, so they have to deal with all of those things at the same time.
Exactly. Yes. In the final, for instance, if you have a classic like Paris-Roubaix or the Tour of Flanders, few people understand how much goes into a race like that. You're talking, 5 hours plus at very high power outputs, plus the technical aspect of riding over wet cobbles and avoiding crashes, and then trying to think tactically. It's the guys are physically and completely mentally exhausted in the last 5 to 10 Ks, and that's it's really a big part of who has that ability to stave off exhaustion and then be able to win the mental effort to make sure that they get to the line in one shape and still upright and strong enough to win.
Going back to what you mentioned before about the communication between the team, between all the riders during a race, what do you think about this aspect of cycling as it is today? Do you think it's adding something? Do you think it's taken something away?
We watched the Olympics. So, for instance, the women's Olympic race, and that was done without radios. And you saw how the Dutch team in the end messed up. Some Marianne Vos said she was aware that there was still a rider away. Her teammates said that they weren't aware that there was still a rider away. In the end, they let somebody stay away and they didn't win gold. Mm-hmm. If you look at it from Austria's side, it was fantastic. So, it was beautiful. She managed to stay away. She managed to befuddle everybody and win the gold medal. If you look at it from Holland's side, you say, well, we need those technological aspects to make sure that, we have a race that ends in a worthy winner. Both sides of the story have merits. I don't have an opinion on which way is the best way. So we'll see how it goes. And I think the UCI has that difficulty as well. They, don't they? And they often, especially with the radios. There was a time when they sort of, tried races with and without, and eventually they settled on the decision to use radios. So, who knows if it's the best decision, but each side has positives and negatives.
I guess it's also just part of the evolution of the sport itself, and all sports evolve and there's new equipment, and you look at spikes on the track and the surface on the track itself, and you can span that thought over all the other disciplines, there's always going to be improvements or changes as technology evolves as well. And then, like you said, sometimes it could be seen as a positive or as a negative, but it's maybe just part of that natural evolution of the discipline itself.
Yeah, we see it in ball sports as well. We see it in football, in
Mm-hmm.
rugby, and cricket, where there's an umpire or official that's off the field and reviews the footage and then gives their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Some people love it, some people hate it.
Yeah, exactly. We just have to deal with it. So since we're in the topic of cycling and the racing competition aspect of it, you are the medical director for the UAE team Emirates World Tour Cycling. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. How long have you been in that role or holding that position?
So the team approached me in July 2018, and it evolved from there. But I started officially in my role in the beginning of 2019.
Mm.
So this is now the third season, and there were a lot of changes, a lot of personnel that were changed, and it brought a number of people who were experts in their field together, and the successes are there to see. We've won the last 2 Tour de France's. We've been ranked in the top 4 teams in the world for the last 2 seasons, from a starting point of 16th in the world rankings. So it's been a really great couple of years, and it's been a privilege to be involved and be part of that whole progress. It's the journey itself that's rewarding, and implementing various aspects and seeing them add value to the direction that the team's going.
So throughout this journey that you've gone along with the team so far, what have been some of your biggest challenges so far?
I think in the beginning, when we first started, the team came from a very Italian background, and I've said it before, that what was surprising was how open everybody was to the change. But obviously there were language barriers, cultural barriers, and bringing in a whole bunch of new protocols and methods that people weren't familiar with, bringing together people from different nationalities, that the new people that joined the team, as well as the existing team personnel and riders, and getting everybody to work together in a way that everybody complements each other. So that initial part sometimes takes time for people to feel comfortable in their role, to realize that they can have confidence in the other people that are doing their job. And then from there things go much more smoothly. But in the beginning, that's obviously the initial challenge.
Mm-hmm. Has there been maybe a consensus amongst the staff in terms of what have been the major pieces or the major things that you guys changed or implemented that allowed you to have those results in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it like in all high performance teams, it's the summation of all of these different components that add to the whole. And those are and we can start on one side. So key things that I think have made a big difference are the training methods. So Inigo San Milan brought along specific training techniques that are employed throughout the team and have had a significant benefit on the riders' overall fitness and ability. There are aspects like biomechanics and optimizing both the normal road position as well as time trial positioning, and getting the guys extremely aerodynamic, but at the same time comfortable and powerful, which is something you can make someone extremely aero, but they won't be able to produce power in that position or stay comfortable enough to produce power and stay fast over a period of 30 or 40 minutes unless they have all the other elements addressed correctly. So the biomechanics side. There's the nutrition side. So Gorka Prieto Balver, he's our nutritionist. We have a periodized nutrition approach, and that works really, really well. What we mean by that is, we tailor the carbohydrate content and the macronutrient content for the training loads that the guys are having at that particular time, and even within the races, and even within a stage. So it's highly tailored specifically to the requirements of the riders. Each rider has an individual plan. So that's also a big factor. From two aspects: recovery and adaptation to training, and from a health perspective, optimizing the training load by having various different monitoring techniques has also been very important. Most of the riders in the past in the pro peloton were grossly overtrained. They did extremely high volumes of training, and many of them, you saw this regularly when they would get injured, or if they fell ill, they'd come back and they'd be much stronger after a period of being unable to train. They'd have a few good results, and then the performances would decline again. And so many riders have that. They have these cycles of good performance, declining performance, illness, recovery, good performance, declining performance, illness, and they wonder why. And the reality is it's simply because you're doing too much. There is an optimal training load. You cannot just train and keep training through fatigue. And that's, and that has been an issue with pro cycling for many, many years. And so we implement a whole battery of load monitoring techniques because there is no gold standard. You have to actually have multiple different methods and then assess them. And, if the majority are pointing in a particular direction, then you can make an informed decision on that. And those are also very important in terms of making sure that riders are recovering and then adapting, because you don't adapt to training if you're not recovered or you're excessively fatigued. So those are just some of the things that have led to success. And by having the cumulative effect of all of those, eventually you can see the successes themselves.
Yeah, can you talk about some of the methods that you guys employ to monitor load and let's say the readiness status of your athletes, whether it's during a training block or during a competition like the Tour de France?
So most teams use Training Peaks as a analysis system, and that is one of the ways that we look at external loads. So in other words, the loads that are applied to the body. So you talk about external and internal load. An external load is the work done, and Training Peaks allows us to assess that external workload. And then they have various different. So looking at acute chronic training load balance gives us an idea of the rider's relative fatigue compared to their fitness. But then we looked at a number of internal load metrics, and one that has been shown to be, despite it being so subjective, has been reliable in assessing fatigue status is self-reported fatigue, self-reported mood, sleep disturbance, and so forth. We combine that with a weekly submaximal fatigue test, which is the derivative of the Lambert's submaximal cycling test, which Robert Lamberts, who did his PhD together with me, we worked together on, he worked on my PhD and I worked on his PhD. And that Lambert submaximal cycling test is the cyclists don't really enjoy doing it because it takes about 18 minutes to do. And it means that, and to do it properly, you need to do it on an indoor trainer. So the guys, they don't really want to set up an indoor trainer. So we modified that and made it a 3-minute test that the riders do at power. The Lambert submaximal cycling test is done at heart rate. So we have a power-based derivative of that. We're currently actually analyzing data which we'll be publishing probably in about 2 to 3 months' time, which looks at how that correlates with all the other load metrics. So we use that. We look at heart rate variability. We look at index session progressions. So there are particular training sessions where if you see either a failure to progress or a reduction in performance, then you know that something is not following the correct process. Either there's an understimulus or an overstimulus or an under recovery. And then every 4 to 6 weeks, we do a battery of blood tests. And we don't do one specific one because, once again, there isn't one that's universally applicable. And so we do a whole battery of those, and so on. So we have a whole series of monitoring tools, and we look at all of them, and then we assess, what the likely outcome or the likely situation is, and then act on that. And sometimes you don't know. You have 3 things pointing one way and 3 things pointing the other way. And then there's a little bit of guessing involved, but the good majority of the time, most of them point to the same thing, and then we know that we need to act in a particular way.
Are there any other methods or maybe tools that you might see yourself using in the maybe next 5 to 10 years to help monitor your athletes' training status or fatigue over time that maybe aren't quite ready yet to be applied, broadly or with a team of pro cyclists, but that you see potential in?
Well, there are constantly new methods being developed, and whether it's Inigo also developed something called a non-invasive muscle glycogen concentration assessment using an ultrasound scanner. And it's commercially available, so you can look at muscle glycogen concentration. And we know that riders who are fatigued or first of all, you have a daily decline in muscle glycogen concentration before training. And riders who are fatigued or overtrained are prone to injury, and an injured muscle doesn't store glycogen, so you can see that there's asymmetry developing. So if one side is a 50-60% muscle glycogen concentration, the other side 30%, then you know that there's an imminent injury that's likely to happen, and that also points to overreaching. So those are the sorts of things that are technologically helpful, but maybe not necessarily at this point ready to be used on a daily basis. But there's a lot of promise in them, and there are lots of other techniques that are developed. Heart rate variability has come a long way, and is now at the point where it's reliable enough to be able to make inferences from.
As long as you, I guess, have a long enough data set beforehand so that you can look at the average and the trend and infer from that, and not just a single data point in time.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to look at trends.
And so out of those different monitoring techniques, if there were one or two that you would apply if, say, you were an amateur cyclist or just someone who wants to train but doesn't want to spend their time monitoring themselves either, just have a good idea of maybe how to adjust over time, what would be the one or two things that you would monitor?
I would say if you had to do three things, and that's three is a good number, because then you 2 out of 3 you're probably pointing at one direction. Use a good software system like Training Peaks and get an external load metric, and then combine it with 2 internal load metrics. Heart rate variability is really easy to do. So, and with the software that's available, Marco Altini's app, HRV for Training, is a great tool to make inferences. And then I would say either use a subjective rating of fatigue. I think we got unstable internet. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Okay, good. So either use a subject. So in other words, listen to your body and make a decision based on your subjective sensations. If you feel that you're excessively fatigued, listen to your body, or use something that's a little bit more advanced, like the submaximal fatigue test or the Lambert submaximal cycling test, which takes into account perceived exertion, heart rate, power, and then make the call from there.
Okay, very good. Moving forward from here, can you talk about strength and conditioning as it applies to pro cycling? What are the cyclists working on outside of their bike sessions throughout the week? Is there a certain frequency that they have, maybe in the off season, and maybe is there still some of this in season? Can you kind of give the lay of the land on that?
Yeah, so we do in our off-season camp. So in December, typically when we do the medical assessments on all the riders, my colleague Adrian Ricciuno, who's a sports physician but also a physiotherapist and previously a teacher in physical education, so he's got a whole battery of skills. He does a strength and conditioning assessment on the riders, which involves a modification of the functional movement screen, where we incorporate specific measurements based on the research that we've done in the last 5 to 6 years on cycling biomechanics. And my former PhD student now in the US, Dr. Wendy Holliday, she uncovered a couple of key elements in terms of the intrinsic factors that are related to performance, and those are things like hamstring flexibility, the strength endurance of the lower leg, so in other words the calf, so plantar flexors, ankle plantar flexors. And so we specifically assess those, and then we have interventions to address any deficits that we see. And so the riders do that strength and conditioning component as part of their weekly training in between the other training sessions. And then we do follow-up assessments to look at whether or not they've actually addressed deficits, to make sure that they're all going in the right direction.
Is there certain movements in that strength and conditioning portion that maybe were frowned upon for a long time in cycling, but are maybe coming back with a vengeance now and seem very useful compared to what we might have thought of them a few years back?
I don't know about any specific movements. I think more that overall strength conditioning was considered unnecessary in cycling. And, there've been research studies that have shown variable results. Do Does it benefit cyclists or not? We know that functional strength training, so in other words, on the bike, low cadence resistance training does have benefit and is a key foundation of power. I think the off the bike aspect, certainly the elements that we've identified in our research are a factor. And so we know that they make a difference. And then there's elements that you would do to prevent injury, so flexibility and strength across key joints to make sure that the riders stay injury free, and may not necessarily be a performance aspect. So it's a mix. It's a mix of injury prevention and specific performance benefits that we've identified.
What are the most common injuries that you might see, let's call them non-crash or non-contact injuries that you see in elite cycling?
The most common one is knee pain. So, and patellofemoral pain or patellar tendinopathy are the two most common knee-related complaints. And then we see lower back pain, and then you have a whole wide variety of overuse injuries, whether it be foot pain, hamstring injuries, neck pain, shoulder pain. But by far the most common is knee pain.
And do you have an idea as to the reason? Is there one thing that usually has an impact on this or is influencing this, or can there be a wide array of different reasons why you might get knee pain when you cycle a lot?
It's mostly related to changes in load. So if you do too much too soon, and so we typically see knee pain in the early part of the season when riders have been off, and then they start to increase their training load. And when they increase their training load quickly, that's a high risk time. And then there's the other side of the risk factor is biomechanics. So some riders have intrinsic factors that put them at risk, whether it's tight hamstrings or tight lateral structures or foot biomechanical abnormalities that result in what we call medial lateral deviation, which is like pronation and those kinds of biomechanical contributors.
All right. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the exercise science side. So what attracted you at the beginning when you got involved in that field of research? Why did you go in that direction and not another one?
I was always inquisitive as to, and I would say when I was a kid, I used to be inquisitive about everything. So I used to disassemble electronic stuff, and I used to read encyclopedias. It sounds very nerdy, but I used to read the encyclopedia from A to Z, and then because that's all we had then. We didn't have the internet, so I had a set of Collier's encyclopedias, and I'd read all about various different things. And that natural curiosity, I guess, stimulated my interest when I started, doing performance sports into, what was the underlying physiological aspect that underpinned that performance. And so it really was a natural curiosity that then got directed in that specific area through my own participation and my own unique experiences. And a lot of the research that we do is stimulated by our own experiences. We either through feedback from athletes or through our own experiences. And a lot of my initial research, particularly my PhD, which was more on the nature of fatigue and how fatigue is actually controlled in an integrated fashion during endurance sport. That came out of my own experience and understanding of what was happening while I was racing and training, and a lot of things are guided by our own experience initially, or something that somebody asks us or tells us, we don't have an answer. So that drives the research, and then we start asking the research questions, and in most cases you actually find out somebody's already answered that question. You just weren't aware of it. So, and that's particularly these days, because now we have access to everything. In the old days, we used to have to go to the library and go and research various journals and see whether or not there was something that had been published in that field. It was incredibly difficult. So I've been in that space where it was transitioning online, and thank God for that, because online makes things so much easier. Now you're just a Google search away from finding the answer. That's a double-edged sword as well, because there are too many pseudo experts, but finding out that the answer is already, and sometimes there isn't an answer, or the answer we look at the research and we find out that, maybe the methods weren't exactly robust. And so we try to reproduce research and we find out that actually the answer was incorrect, and we evolve from there. But that's sort of how the research comes about.
Through that learning process and discovery process that you've gone through over those many, many years, in the research field, what have been your biggest paradigm shifts? Things you've realized that maybe you had a certain idea on before, and then through your research, through your experience as well, practical experience, you discovered to maybe be false and had to change the way you perceived something.
Yeah, I mean, my thesis was a pretty much a prime example. So in the past, everything was reductionist and peripheral. So the Norwegians did all the research on. I'm not the Norwegians, the Scandinavians, various different countries in Scandinavia did a lot of the research on the cardiovascular respiratory model of fatigue and VO2 max testing, and then basically we had this model that your maximal oxygen supply determines your final performance, and that's really where the determinants lie. When I started my PhD, Tim Noakes had developed the central governor model, and it was completely opposite. It was all brain. And as my PhD progressed, the realization was that actually it's not. It's both. And so, we published 3 years ago now, Zig Sinclair Gibson, Ross Tucker, and myself published our integrative model of fatigue, where we cover basically the spectrum of all of the research that we've been conducting and other people have been conducting, and present the integrative model. So that was really, was a swing from coming in thinking it was completely wrong to realizing we weren't exactly right either, to realizing it's somewhere in between. And that often happens, you realize that it's sometimes somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. If we talk now about performance testing in cycling, how is that? You talked about VO2 max testing. How has those different testing protocols, how have those evolved over the years, and what is regarded now in elite cycling as a necessary test to perform, and I guess useful tests to draw data from to then influence what we're going to do in training, what we might be able to do in a race, etc.
So in the past, they used to always do a VO2 max test, which typically is some protocol that's anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes a bit longer depending on the protocol. And and we do know that a VO2 max result, so in other words, the peak power output that you produce so the average of the final minute of a test, where it's a ramp test to exhaustion, does predict performance in the field. We see that it accurately predicts 40-kilometer time trial performance. It predicts performance in a 90-minute maximal effort in a 100-kilometer time trial. But it often didn't really predict the performance in a stage race or a single-day race. And people used to think, oh, well, that's all got to do with the tactics and the way the race unfolds. The reality is that many top cyclists don't have high VO2 maxes. And we ended up realizing actually that a VO2 max test doesn't tell you everything. There's so many other aspects. And then you started to have the power meters develop and the software. And one of the key metrics that everybody talks about now is functional threshold power, which is supposed to be a 60-minute maximal effort, but nobody wants to do a 60-minute maximal effort because the climbs aren't long enough and you can't find a route that's rolling or flat that doesn't have, traffic lights and various other problems. So in the end, they did a 20-minute test, which does correlate with the 60-minute result. And so everybody uses the 20-minute FTP test. And that also gives you a relatively good index of performance. It's longer, so it tells you what more sustained power outputs are. And so, now we have the VO2 max test, we have the FTP test. And now we're seeing this emergence of fatigue resistance. So now there are a whole bunch so we want to now create power duration curves. So you do a battery of tests, you do a 1 or 2 minute maximal effort, a 5-minute effort, and for instance, a 10 to 15 minute long maximal effort. And then you can construct or model a power duration curve. And then you can see how that changes at the end of and now the cutoffs are, depending on whether it's women's cycling, men's cycling, elite or sub-elite, 2,000, 2,500 or 3,000 kilojoules energy expenditure before redoing the power duration curve. And that's what we call fatigue resistance. And so that's now the new area that we're looking at. And there are other tests that you can do, whether it's your respiratory, I shouldn't say thresholds. I think somebody told you on Twitter not to use that term, but respiratory, I'll find a better term, but anyway, inflection points or transition zones and lactate, curves and so forth. But there's so many different tests that can be performed, but they all have their strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. So for you, do you, at the level where you operate, do you still find it useful to have this VO2 max test completed? Again, knowing that maybe the VO2 max itself isn't the greatest indicator of performance, but within that test, I'll use the term, it's okay, I'll use thresholds as a term, because there are those, I guess in my mind, there's those two big thresholds that we need to be aware of in order to optimize training and know the status of the athlete. Like you said, there's, whether you call it FTP or critical power or MLSS, and obviously those are not exactly the same point and they don't all measure the same thing, but we got that, call it the second threshold, the second bracket of transition between one state and another. And then we have that first one as well. So do you still assess those two, let's just call them thresholds, first and second, whatever other name you want to give them? Are those still important parameters to measure in your athletes?
They are in a certain context. So what we do as a battery of tests on elite level cyclists and triathletes, for instance, is we do a prolonged step test. So we do a 7-minute step test. And in that step test, we measure respiratory gases and blood lactate concentration. And we use those to look at the fat max values. So we look at fat oxidation. It's not as reliable as we'd like. There isn't a better method to assess it. So we use that data, but we know that there is some variability and there may be some error in that data. Mm-hmm. We look at the lactate accumulation point. I wouldn't call it the maximal lactate steady state, because to do that, you actually have to do a much more difficult protocol where you bring the athlete back on a number of different days. So true maximal lactate steady state testing is very difficult to do. So we call it lactate accumulation assessment for that reason. And we use that data to understand where the optimal training intensity should be to maximize the metabolic improvements in an athlete. Mm-hmm. And then we typically have a break of about 90 minutes, and then we do a VO2 max test. And the VO2 max test also gives us additional data. So we can see the respiratory exchange ratio, we can see the VO2 max, we can see the peak power output, and other values. And then we have an overall picture of that athlete's capabilities. And then if we add now fatigue resistance into that, we can further define the characteristics of that athlete. So there's no key variable that we link with performance. We look at a spectrum of variables, and we then use that spectrum to assess the athlete as a whole.
Mm-hmm. What would you say for maybe an amateur cyclist listening who wants to quantify his progress and wants to have some guidelines in order to inform his training? What would you say would be maybe the one or the two things to determine for them in order to have a coherent plan that matches their current physiological status and capabilities, but without, like you said, just spending days and days doing multiple tests?
Yeah, I mean, the most cost-effective way is to actually, if you have a power meter, is to simply do a number of maximal efforts. The true measure of performance is performance. So if you go out and you do a 30-second maximal effort, a 1-minute maximal effort, a 5-minute maximal effort, a 10-minute maximal effort, and a 20-minute maximal effort, then you get a very good idea of where your strengths and weaknesses are. Obviously, you can't do them all at the same time, so you've got to spread them out over a number of days, sometimes even a week or so. That's if you don't have access to a laboratory and you don't have the means to measure all of these things indirectly by doing these various different assessments that we do. That would give you some indication of what areas to focus on. But it does require to measure fat max and various other factors. Efficiency, so economy, requires a metabolic cart, and that's expensive. So that means going to a laboratory.
So talk a little bit about fat max. Why is it important for athletes to know, or for coaches to know about their athletes, where that might happen? Again, it's going to be a bracket, and we know it can vary from day to day depending on different things like fatigue status, nutrition, hydration, etc. Why is it important to know where that let's say zone is?
A number of reasons. So we know, so what we're talking about there is a term that's thrown about a lot these days, and that's metabolic flexibility. And we know that in endurance sports, so cycling, and so whether it's marathon, mountain biking, road cycling, and triathlon, where it's longer than a particular distance. So if you were a 5,000 meter athlete on the track, it wouldn't be important. But in endurance sports, it is important because you have a finite amount of fuel in the form of carbohydrate, and there's a finite amount of fuel that you can ingest and absorb in the form of carbohydrate. So having the flexibility to change fuel sources is really a determinant of performance. You can do an Ironman on a ketogenic diet, and you can have a very, very bonk-free Ironman and do a reasonably good time. But if you want to be the winner in Kona, you're not going to do that on a ketogenic diet. And the reason is you cannot unlock that level of performance from fat oxidation. So, but you cannot do that just on carbohydrate alone, because you can't ingest enough carbohydrate and have the carbohydrate stores to be able to make it to the finish in the kind of power output required for a top Ironman performance. And so you need to be able to access fats as a fuel source efficiently, but still be able to use carbohydrates as a fuel source to be able to produce the high power outputs. And that's what we talk about when we talk about metabolic flexibility. And so you can use a FatMax test to identify the training intensity, and then we use faster training sessions to stimulate an improvement in fat oxidation. And we see, an athlete that has a maximal fat oxidation of 0.4 grams per minute over a period of, 12 to 18 months can increase that to 0.7, 0.8 grams per minute. And so that's a very trainable aspect. And that then, will translate into performance in the field. And then obviously the other metabolic aspect is, maximal carbohydrate oxidation and being able to shunt carbohydrates through mitochondria, from glycolysis through mitochondria, oxidize them, and also redistribute them. That also requires training at an intensity. It's not at maximal lactate steady state. It's actually significantly below that, at what we call your lactate accumulation point. And so the testing allows us to identify those intensity zones.
Yeah, so I'll give a shot to maybe rephrasing what you said in terms of the metabolic flexibility. So if we're at a lower intensity, we're going to be ideally primarily oxidizing fats in order to fuel our effort. But again, if we need to go higher in the power output range, we're going to have to start using some sugars at some point, because that substrate can just simply give us more quicker. And so we're going to be able to use that to generate those higher power outputs. But then we have to be flexible enough from a metabolic standpoint to come back down, to get rid of all the lactate that's accumulated from glycolysis and get back down to fats as quickly as possible to, again, get back on saving mode, so to speak, recharge our tank, if we want to talk with those terms, and then be ready to go again. Like you said, if you have to catch up to the one in front of you, or if it's time to kick for the end of the race, you need to have that gear available again. So is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you look at a Tour de France stage, for the first hour is full gas. If the riders get dropped in the first hour because the brake is constantly trying to get off, there are other teams that are trying to prevent that break. Everybody's got their own agenda. So the first hour typically is just full on. And if you don't have the power to stay in the peloton, that's it. Your day's over, your tour's over. So there you got to go full gas. After the first hour, sometimes as long as 90 minutes, things settle down and the break goes away, and people just, and everybody relaxes in the peloton, except the team that's obviously controlling the race, if they've got their team leader. And you can, if you look at the power outputs required, so a rider, for instance, who's in a breakaway could average 300 to 320 watts for 5 hours to stay in a breakaway to the finish. A rider sitting in the peloton, in the middle of the peloton on a relatively flat stage, could average 120 watts for that same distance. So you're looking at, up 2.5-fold greater energy expenditure in the breakaway than you are sitting in the middle of the peloton. And so if it's a race that finishes in a climb and you're a GC favorite, you're sitting in the middle of the peloton at 100 to 150 watts, maybe some small accelerations, predominantly burning fat as a fuel source, sparing your muscle glycogen, because you're going to need that. If it's a 40-minute long climb, the Angleroo, for instance, you're going to burn through the majority of your glycogen stores in a single effort, and you need to have those available. That's where that metabolic flexibility comes in, to make sure that you're not tapping into that glycogen while you're cruising along at 150 watts or 120 watts.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before that power duration profile. So I assume we're talking critical power, W prime, and those that kind of model applied to quantifying performance below and above that, let's call it second threshold, if I may. Are you guys at the point where you're using those to model certain approaches or race paces and such in real time? Or I know that's something that has been used in the Breaking 2 project with Nike, for example, and so it is in some ways applicable if we get the right algorithms, obviously, and the right numbers together. But is that a consideration now, or is that something that might come into play in the future?
They do model performance quite well. So there's a reasonably high predictive capacity for W prime and for critical power. And so you could use those to predict performance. The reality is that in the context of a race situation, it's not always in your control. So you have to follow the race. And so you either have what it takes or you don't. And so to answer your question, the short answer is no. The riders are either capable of doing it or not. We can use that data to retrospectively look at racing and training data and stratify riders' capabilities and be able to understand their strengths and weaknesses better. But in the moment, no, you wouldn't use that. Not in road racing.
Okay, if we talk now about you mentioned fatigue in endurance sports as being one of your main focuses through some of your research. So can you talk about the importance of that glycogen stores element that you mentioned a couple times already today? So what can athletes do to increase those stores? We talked about the sparing idea by using mostly fat, so developing that side of your metabolism. But what can we do to have the biggest glycogen store available? And then can you talk also about the nutritional interventions throughout a race in order to try and improve that?
If you start at the training side, there's a misunderstanding by many athletes that endurance training requires long, steady riding and lots of hours on the bike. We know that doing high intensity interval training not only makes you better at doing high intensities, but it also enhances your endurance capacity. It stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, and it also increases, for instance, glycogen synthesis and glycogen storage. So an athlete who does high intensity training has greater glycogen stores than an athlete who just does endurance-based training. So there are training related aspects that you can do to enhance your endurance that aren't just riding for long periods of time. But the biggest impact really is the nutrition side of things. And we know that exogenous carbohydrate ingestion at rates now, if you look at the latest research, we know that 110, 120 grams an hour is possible. Particularly for larger riders. So a rider who's over 75 kilograms can ingest and absorb 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour, providing it's a composition that's a mix of maltodextrin or glucose-based polymers and fructose, because fructose has its own glucose uptake transporter compared to sodium-dependent glucose uptake transporter 1, which is where glucose gets absorbed. And so the mixture of the carbohydrates is very important. And if you have that composition and you also train the gut, so training the gut is important. So I see so many athletes who will go and do a race and ingest 80 to 90 grams an hour. And then you ask them, but what do you do in training? And they tell you, no, I train on water because I'm trying to train myself to, be able to do without this. And then when it comes to the race, then it's like a bonus. It doesn't work that way. You've got to actually train your gut to absorb the carbohydrates. So you've got to do maximally fueled sessions at a relatively high intensity to be able to fuel yourself better in the race scenario. And so that's a big factor. And then obviously the other aspects, for instance, sparing the glycogen by being more efficient using fats and so forth. So it's a whole spectrum of different things that can add to an enhanced glycogen status at the end of the race.
Yeah, like you mentioned, I can't imagine digestion being easy during such a high intensity effort. It's definitely something, like you said, as a rule of thumb, you should, and correct me if I'm off here, but you should never do something new on race day. You should have tried it at least a few times beforehand in training to make sure that you've dialed all the things down, and you could just now apply yourself and try to get to the end, right? So you definitely don't want to wait until race day to try something different. You want to have done it before.
Golden rule, absolutely. So never do anything new on race day. That's an old rule, but still totally relevant today.
Still holds, exactly. Can you give an idea of how many calories those cyclists are ingesting on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in training or in competition?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on obviously the intensity and the duration of the exercise and whether it's stochastic or steady state, but thousands of kilocalories per in each stage. So really, I mean, you can see these infographics, you know, of the amount of energy that riders consume, that riders use, you know, and you then you get an idea. You know, we're talking like 6 double cheeseburgers in one Tour de France stage, for instance, in a high mountain stage. You know, it's a huge amount of caloric expenditure.
So now we're done the race, and we know our big fundamentals when it comes to recovery. So we need our sleep, we need our nutrition, our hydration. Beyond those basic pillars, and obviously mitigating stress, but beyond those basic pillars, what recovery techniques have you guys found to be useful to the athletes during a competition? And then do those recovery methods change outside of competition when they're more in a training phase?
Yeah, I mean, in a race situation, so if you're in a grand tour like the Tour de France, you know, everything counts, from the environment on the bus. The riders arrive back on the bus, they get given their recovery drink, they get looked after by the soigneurs. Everything is ready for them to get changed back into their normal clothes after they've had a shower. You know, it's a as calm an environment as possible. Then back at the hotel, you know, from using mattresses, many of the teams do that. We do that as well. We have our own mattresses. Riders like to have their own pillows. There's so many different things, you know, blue light blockers, you know, avoiding exposure to electronic devices. And if you do have exposure to them, to use, we have glasses supplied by Shikon that are blue light blockers. The riders use those in after hour times. And so, yeah, a bunch of different things like that.
All right. Very, very interesting. Jeroen, if you had one piece of advice to give to maybe the cyclists who are listening, one thing that you see maybe advanced or amateur and advanced cyclists do that maybe if they manage that a little bit better, they could, you know, maybe reach a higher level and improve their performance. What are maybe the 1 or 2 biggest mistakes that you still see in the cycling world as a whole?
I wouldn't necessarily identify a mistake, but I would say in terms of being able to reach a higher level, it's consistency that matters. Show up every day and do what's required. Don't try and rush it. There are no shortcuts. So every overnight success takes 10 years. So, you know, maybe not 10 years, but it takes time. So be consistent. And if you consistently apply the right principles, you'll get there.
I like that very much. Last question for you today. What are you currently interested in? What are you looking into? What are you learning about to advance your own understanding of, you know, human physiology, sports performance?
You know, the kind of research that I do is not hyper focused on one area. So they talk about hedgehogs who dig further and further into the hedge, and you get, you know, super specialists. I'm not a super specialist. I'm very diverse, and that has its own, you know, its own benefits in terms of being able to take information from different areas. And so my research is very broad. You know, I have current interests in nutrition, cycling biomechanics, injury prevention, etc. And I wouldn't say I'm specifically in one area at any given time. And that's really the beauty of it. It keeps me interested, and each of those areas augment my understanding of the other in some way or another.
And out of all the areas that you've cited, which one do you see the biggest potential for improvement in the next maybe 5 or 10 years?
Gee, I don't have an answer to it for that one. I think we see as we go through the journey, we see what we have and we take it from there. But my predictive capacity is limited at this point in time. I wouldn't see a specific area being one that's the area of importance.
Yeah, it's a bit of a trick question given that we can't know what we don't know yet. So we'll just have to wait and see as we go.
Exactly.
Jeroen, I really appreciate you taking the time today. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a great pleasure as well.
If people want to chat with you, find out more about what you do, where can they find you online?
You can find me on Twitter. That's where I'm most active on social media. So Jeroen Swart, straightforward, no strange names or identities. So straightforward. You can find me on Twitter. Welcome to engage with me there.
Fantastic. I'll leave the link in the comment for anybody who's interested. Again, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.